There is a particular kind of man who learns early that the world will tell you exactly who it is, if you are quiet enough to listen. I learned that at 23, working the overnight shift at a lumber yard outside of Sudbury, Ontario, stacking 2x4s in -20 weather, because my father had told me that no business built on borrowed money ever truly belongs to you. So I saved. I worked. I kept my mouth shut and my eyes open, and I let the world show me what it was. My name is Walter Briggs. I am 67 years old. I drive a 1999 Ford F-150 that my daughter has described as, and I am quoting here, a public safety concern. It is green, or it was green once. Now it is more of a suggestion of green, the kind of color a truck earns after 25 years of Canadian winters and gravel roads, and a man who believes that if something still runs, it still has something left to say. I live in the same house on Alder Crescent in Sudbury that I bought in 1992, 2 stories, a covered porch, a maple tree in the backyard, that my wife Claire planted the year our daughter was born, and that has outlasted everything except my memory of the day she planted it. My neighbor Ed Kowalski, retired school teacher, terrible at cards, once leaned over my back fence on a Saturday in October and told me that I was, in his exact words, the most stubborn man he had ever met for not buying a decent vehicle. I told him the truck was fine. He said it was not fine. I said I appreciated his input. We talked about the Leafs for 20 minutes and I went back inside to make dinner. Here is what Ed Kowalski does not know. What the people at my church on Regent Street do not know. What the young man at the Canadian Tire on La Salle who once tried to upsell me on a rust protection package did not know when I smiled and said, "No thank you, son. I think she'll be all right." I own Northmark Capital, commercial real estate, private equity, a timber holdings division, and a property management portfolio that stretches from Sudbury to Calgary to the outskirts of Halifax, structured carefully, deliberately, through a series of numbered companies and holding entities with names that mean nothing to anyone who does not already know what they are looking for. My name does not appear on a single press release. There is no photograph of me in any business magazine. There is no LinkedIn profile, no charity gala where I'm given a plaque, no alumni newsletter that lists me among the successful graduates. Northmark Capital manages assets worth approximately $2.4 billion. I drive a truck with a crack in the windshield and a heater that takes 12 minutes to warm up properly, and I would not change one single thing about that. Now let me tell you about my daughter. Nora Briggs is 32 years old, and she is, without any exaggeration I can think of, the best thing that has ever happened to me. She got her mother's patience, her mother's laugh, that particular laugh that starts somewhere in the middle of her chest and kind of ambushes everyone in the room, including herself. She got my stubbornness, which she would probably describe less charitably. When she was 9 years old, she informed me very calmly that my approach to conflict resolution was, quote, not optimal. She had been watching a documentary about negotiation. I didn't know what to say, so I told her she was probably right. She beamed like I'd handed her the moon. What I did not prepare for was the man she married. 2 years ago, Nora brought home a man named Preston Holt. I want to be fair. I want to give the man a proper introduction, so let me say this as carefully as I can. Preston Holt is 37 years old. He is tall, broad-shouldered, well-groomed in that particular way that requires considerably more time than it appears to require. He wears the kind of casual Friday clothes that cost what a mechanic makes in a week. He drives a new Audi that he mentions, not constantly, but often enough that you begin to notice the pattern. Within the first 30 minutes of meeting me, he had mentioned his MBA from Queens, a deal he had closed in Vancouver, and the fact that he had recently been skiing at Whistler. He said Whistler the way people say it when they want you to picture them at Whistler. I nodded. I said that sounded like a wonderful trip. He smiled the smile of a man who had received the response he expected. 8 months after meeting Nora, Preston Holt was appointed Vice President of Operations at Hallmark Property Group. Now I need you to understand something here. Hallmark Property Group is a subsidiary of Northmark Capital. It is a solid company, 160 employees, commercial lease management across 4 provinces, good systems, reliable revenue. Preston Holt applied through a recruiting firm, went through 3 rounds of interviews, passed a reference check, received an evaluation from the regional board, and was offered the position at a compensation level I reviewed and approved personally. What Preston Holt did not know, what he still does not know, as of the morning I am telling you this, is that I watched every single one of his interviews through a standing arrangement with the recruiting firm. I read his references myself. I reviewed the board evaluation. I approved his salary. I signed the internal authorization that put him in that office. Then I drove home, changed out of my work clothes, and spent the rest of the afternoon replacing a fence post in the backyard that had been leaning since April. Preston sent me a text that evening. Big news. Just got a VP offer. Major company. Nora's over the moon. Hard work pays off. I wrote back, well deserved, son, proud of you. Then I put my phone down and watched the news. I want to be honest about something. I wanted to give Preston Holt a real chance. I am not a man who decides about people quickly. I have hired enough of them over 40 years to know that first impressions are just data, not conclusions. People are complicated. People grow. I know men who started out exactly like Preston and became someone worth knowing. Preston did not grow in the direction I had hoped. It started the way these things always start, with small moments you file away without fully acknowledging. The way he talked over Nora at dinner when the subject turned to money. The way he never once asked me a question about my life that wasn't a setup to talk about his own. The way he once described my truck to his friend on the phone, not knowing I was in the next room, as my father-in-law's catastrophe. But the moment that changed things happened on a Wednesday afternoon about 5 months ago. I was in Hallmark's building on Durham Street for a quarterly review, moving quietly through the offices the way I do, the way I have always done, unremarkable, just a plain-looking older man in a plain-looking jacket that nobody gave a second thought. As I came around the corner near the executive suites, I heard Preston's voice. He was talking to someone, another manager from the sound of it, keeping his voice low but not quite low enough. He was saying my name. My father-in-law, he said, and I could hear the particular tone in his voice that people use when they are performing mildly affectionate condescension for an audience. Walter. Good old Walter. Total character. Drives that ancient truck, lives in that same old house since forever. You know the type. Salt of the earth, right? He paused and then he laughed quietly. Nora worries about him a lot. I keep telling her he's fine. He had his day, you know. Small business, local stuff, probably did all right for Sudbury. But this world, he gestured at the building around him without knowing I was 30 feet away. This isn't really his world anymore. This isn't really his world anymore. I stood there for a moment. I straightened my jacket. I walked back the way I had come. I let those words sit with me for a long time. My father used to say that a still pond reflects more clearly than a rushing river. I kept very still. If this is your first time here, do us a favor and hit subscribe. It means more than you know and it costs you nothing. The invitation came 6 weeks later. Preston's parents, Hugh and Carolyn Holt, were hosting a Thanksgiving weekend dinner at their property in Muskoka. They had a cottage there, which is one way to put it. The way Nora described it suggested that the word cottage was doing some heavy lifting. Hugh Holt had spent 30 years as a senior partner at a Bay Street investment firm. Carolyn was a retired interior designer whose work I had seen featured once in a magazine at a dentist's office, the kind of magazine that made a room look like no human had ever actually sat down in it. They wanted a family gathering, everyone together. Dad, you'll love them, Nora said. They're very welcoming people. I said I was sure they were. I said I was looking forward to it. Then Preston called me directly. He was warm on the phone. Easy. The particular warmth of someone who is about to say something slightly uncomfortable and has already decided it is for your own good. He said, hey, so just a heads up, Hugh and Carolyn, they do things a certain way up there, right? They're pretty traditional, so it might be worth maybe, I don't know, not bringing the truck. I could come get you, or we could arrange something. And maybe, something a little dressier than usual. Nothing over the top. Just Hugh notices things. There was a pause. Preston, I said pleasantly, I appreciate you thinking of me. Of course, absolutely, he said quickly. Just want it to go smoothly. You know how it is. I do, I said. See you Saturday. I hung up the phone. I stood in my hallway for a moment, looking at my own reflection in the narrow mirror by the front door that Claire picked out at an antique market in Parry Sound about 20 years ago. Then I went to my bedroom, opened my closet, moved past the section at the back where I keep the things I wear when things are serious, the charcoal wool suit, the navy one. The clothes I wore the morning Northmark closed a deal in Calgary that the other side had spent 8 months trying to prevent. Moved past all of it. I pulled out a clean pair of dark trousers and a plain flannel shirt, well pressed, nothing remarkable. Set them out for Saturday. Then I went out to the driveway, put my hand on the hood of the F-150, the way you rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you trust. And I thought, we're going to Muskoka. Dress code is quiet. We've always been good at quiet. Saturday arrived the way certain days arrive when you already know what they are going to become. Calmly, without announcement, the way the first frost comes in September, you wake up, and it is simply there. I was up at 5:30, the way I have been up, at 5:30 every morning for the better part of 40 years, made my coffee on the old Braun machine that Nora has tried to replace with something newer on 2 separate birthdays, and I have quietly returned both times. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the light come in slow and gray through the window that looks out at Claire's maple tree. The leaves were past peak, that second week of October, when the color is fading, but the structure is still there, all that bone and branch showing through. I was calm. I am always calm when it matters. It is the thing I worked hardest to learn, and the thing most people in my life have most consistently underestimated. The drive to Muskoka took 2.5 hours. The F-150 made most of it without complaint. The heater ran warm, which in October is exactly what you want. I took the 400 north and then cut across on the back roads the way I prefer, through the birch and the rock cuts and the little towns that feel like they've been keeping the same secrets since 1965. I had the radio on low. I was not thinking about Hugh Holt or his Bay Street career or his property in Muskoka. I was thinking about my father, who once told me that the most dangerous thing you can be is someone that nobody thinks they need to take seriously. The Holt property sat at the end of a long lane off a private road, visible from a distance as a low, sprawling structure of cedar and glass, the kind of place that announces itself with its own restraint, as if to say, we do not need to be obvious. We simply are. There were 2 other cars already in the gravel turnaround, both newer models, both the kind of vehicles that don't look expensive until you know what you're looking at. I parked the F-150 at the edge of the turnaround. It looked exactly like what it was. Hugh Holt met me at the door himself. He was a tall man, 70 or so, silver-haired, with the kind of physical ease that comes from a lifetime of being right in rooms full of people. He wore a linen shirt, pressed slacks, loafers that probably cost more than my truck's last service. His handshake was exactly what it needed to be and nothing more. I noticed. "Walter," he said, smiling the smile. "So glad you could make it. Come in, come in." The interior was everything you would expect from a designer's own property. High beams, a wall of windows looking out over the lake. Furniture that was beautiful, and furniture is beautiful when someone has spent real money on it and then arranged it very carefully to look like they hadn't thought about it. The lake outside was dark blue and flat in the October light. Carolyn Holt came from the kitchen end of the house. She was precise and put together in the way that some women are when elegance is something they have chosen to work at for a very long time. Her earrings were small and expensive. Her smile had warmth in it. The question was how much of it was real. "Walter," she said, taking both my hands the way people do when they want touch to stand in for sincerity. "We have heard so many lovely things. You must be so proud of that daughter of yours." Then, with the smallest pivot, the kind you only catch if you are watching, "Nora is such a wonderful girl. It must have been hard, raising her alone after everything. Just you and her." She tilted her head fractionally. "She does have her mother's warmth, doesn't she? Lucky she had so much of that to hold on to." I looked at Carolyn Holt and I smiled. "You are quite right," I said. "She has always had more of her mother than she knows." Nora appeared from across the room and wrapped her arms around me the way she has since she was small. I held on to that for a moment. Preston materialized behind her and put a hand on my shoulder. "Walter, glad you made it." He glanced once at my clothes, a flicker half a second, the small controlled expression of a man recalibrating. Hugh opened something from a Niagara Peninsula winery, the kind that comes in a plain-looking bottle that costs more than it pretends to. He was generous with it. He spoke about the market, about a development project in King City that he was watching, about Preston's instincts and what he called the boy's uncommon sense of how capital moves. I noticed he directed the last sentence toward me conversationally, the way you might mention a mountain to a man who has only seen photographs of mountains. I nodded. I said that sounded very promising. I complimented the wine before I tasted it. Carolyn spoke to Nora about the cottage renovations, about the neighborhood back in Toronto, about a friend's daughter who had just married someone from a very good family. Then she turned to Nora with a warm, measured smile and said, "You know, it is such a relief when a woman finds someone who can really provide." Not every girl ends up in that position. You've been very fortunate. The table went briefly quiet. Nora smiled graciously. I watched her hands beneath the table. They were not still. I picked up my water glass and said nothing at all. Because the envelope had not arrived yet, and I had learned 40 years ago that patience is not the same as passivity. Patience is knowing exactly when to move and choosing, with complete deliberateness, to wait one moment longer. The envelope arrived after the main course, over what Carolyn called a cheese selection that had been arranged with the focused intensity of a still life painting. Hugh reached beneath his side of the table and produced a slim leather portfolio. He smoothed it with one hand, the way men do who have spent their lives presenting things across tables, and he set it in front of me. "Walter," he said, his voice dropping into the register that I associate with men who have rehearsed the next few sentences at least twice in the bathroom mirror. "There's an opportunity we wanted to raise as a family." I looked at the portfolio. I did not touch it. Preston sat very straight, the posture of a man performing casualness. Nora looked at me quickly, uncertain, and then back at her father-in-law. Her hands were in her lap. Hugh continued. "Preston has a vision, a real one, a venture of his own firm, built from scratch, his instincts at the center of it. We've had this evaluated by people we trust completely, and the fundamentals are excellent. All it needs is the right initial position." He paused. "What we're proposing is a fairly simple arrangement. Nora's inheritance, whatever she would receive from your estate, used now as collateral to secure the startup financing. Properly documented, legally clean, above board in every way." His eyes met mine. "We just need your support, Walter, as her father." The family around the table pulled in slightly, the way people do when they are watching something they have discussed ahead of time. I thought, "You have absolutely no idea who you just put this in front of." I picked up the portfolio. I read every page, all of it, slowly, while the fire in the grate moved quietly, and the lake outside went dark, and no one at that table said a word that I did not invite. I read every clause, every number. The repayment structure that was generous to Preston in ways that a first reading might not immediately reveal. The collateral terms, the timeline. I closed it, set it gently on the table, picked up my water glass, took a slow, even sip, and looked at Hugh Holt with the warmest expression in my possession. "I appreciate the thought that went into this," I said pleasantly. "I'll look at it carefully." Hugh exhaled the way a man exhales when he believes the hard work is finished. Preston's shoulders came down a quarter inch. Carolyn reached for her wine with the energy of a woman who believes the evening has gone exactly as planned. I finished my water. I spent another pleasant 20 minutes talking about the Muskoka weather and the state of the 400 on holiday weekends. I thanked Carolyn for an exceptional meal. I shook Hugh's hand at the door, firmly, and held his eyes for 1 second longer than necessary. He didn't know what that second was carrying. I walked out to the gravel turnaround. The F-150 sat at the edge of the lot under the dark October sky. I got in. The engine turned over with its familiar rumble, that sound I have known for 25 years, and I drove back down the private road and onto the back highway south towards Sudbury. I was completely calm, the kind of calm that comes not from having no feelings but from knowing exactly what you are about to do. I said nothing for 12 days. I tended my backyard on the Sunday. I had coffee with Ed Kowalski on the Wednesday, and he complained about his property tax assessment, and I agreed it seemed high. I went to church. I drove the F-150 to the grocery store and to my weekly meeting at a small office on Elm Street that nobody has ever needed to know about. On day 5, Preston texted me, "Hey Walter, just checking in. Hope you had a chance to look at the package. Thoughts?" I waited 4 hours. Then I wrote, "Still reviewing, son. These things deserve attention." He sent a thumbs up. I set my phone down and made a phone call. Not to Preston, not to Hugh Holt. To 3 people, the senior members of Hallmark Property Group's governance board. People who had worked with Northmark for years, who understood without being told that when I called on a private line on a weekday morning, it was not a social occasion. "Run an operational audit," I said. "Full scope. Start immediately. I want everything documented." Then I hung up and went back to my fence. Because here is what Preston Holt had not read carefully enough. His employment agreement, which I had drafted with specific language 15 years before I ever heard his name, contained a non-competition and proprietary information clause. A clause that addressed, in clear terms, the use of company resources, client relationships, and operational knowledge for competing ventures. It was one of the first things I built into every senior-level contract at Northmark. Not because I anticipated any specific person, but because I had learned early that the people most likely to need that clause are always the people most certain it will never apply to them. The audit took 9 days. When the report came to me, I sat with it for a long time. Not because I was surprised by what it contained. I was not surprised. I sat with it because I wanted to be completely certain before I did what came next. The way you want to be completely certain before you do anything that cannot be undone. Preston Holt had spent the better part of 7 months building the foundation of his independent venture. On company time. On company devices and systems. Using Hallmark's client relationships and operational contacts. People he had access to only because of the position I had placed him in. To construct the early framework of a competing property management firm. He had done it carefully, incrementally, in small enough pieces that no single action would draw immediate attention. He had forgotten something I consider basic. You cannot build a secret inside a house that belongs to the man whose name you cannot read on the wall. Every email, every meeting booked through company calendars, every client contact made on company time. All of it a direct and documented breach of the clause he had signed. All of it in a folder on my desk on a Tuesday morning when I put on the charcoal wool suit from the back of my closet, pressed the night before, and drove the F-50 to Durham Street. I parked in the reserved space near the main entrance. The small placard on the post read Northmark Capital, Reserved. Preston had parked next to that post twice a week for 8 months without ever asking whose name was behind those 2 words. I walked into the boardroom. I sat at the head of the table. The 3 board members were already there. My legal counsel was on my left. The audit summary was in a folder in front of me. 4 minutes later, Preston Holt walked through the door. He came in the way he always came in, confident, measured, the ease of a man who has never once doubted that he belongs in the rooms he enters. He looked around the table. He saw the board members, the legal counsel, the documents. His eyes moved to the head of the table and found me sitting there in a suit he had never once seen me wear. I watched it happen across his face the way you watch weather move across a lake. First the boardroom itself, then the faces, then the suit, and then in the particular silence that followed, the slow arrival of understanding, piece by piece, floor by floor, the recruitment process, the employment contract, the audit, the portfolio on the table in Muskoka, the reserved parking space, the Wednesday meetings on Elm Street, the F-150 and the gravel turnaround that he had described, to someone on a phone in the next room, as my father-in-law's catastrophe, all of it arriving at once. The silence lasted close to 10 seconds. I let every one of them land. Then I said quietly, "Sit down, Preston." He sat. "I am going to say this once," I said. "Not because I'm angry. I want you to understand that clearly. I'm not angry. Anger is for men who didn't see this coming, and I saw this coming before you ever sat across a dinner table from me. I'm telling you this once because you deserve to understand what actually happened, and because my daughter loves you, and because those 2 facts are the only reason this conversation is happening privately instead of publicly." I opened the folder. Hallmark Property Group is a wholly owned subsidiary of Northmark Capital. Northmark Capital is mine. Has been since I built it, piece by piece, starting with a single commercial property in Sudbury in 1988. The company you have been working for, the platform you have spent 8 months treating as a launchpad for your own venture, exists because I built it. I gave you that position because I saw something in you that I thought was worth developing. I gave you access to those clients, those systems, that knowledge, because I trusted you with it. I closed the folder. The clause in your contract is unambiguous. Every action the audit documented falls within its scope. Our legal team is prepared to pursue this to its full conclusion. Preston looked at the board members. They looked back at him steadily. He looked at my counsel. Same. He looked at me. There was something in his face that I had not fully expected. Not the performance of a man trying to manage a situation, not the calculation of someone looking for an exit. Something quieter than that. Something that had the specific quality of a man looking at himself without any of the usual defenses in place and finding the view genuinely difficult. "However," I said, "I am not here to end your career. I am here to correct a course. So here is what happens. You resign from Hallmark today. You do it quietly and professionally. The documentation stays within these walls. Your reputation stays intact. Or we proceed legally and every page of that audit becomes a matter of record." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll resign." His voice was different than I had heard it before. Smaller, more honest. Good, I said. I stood and buttoned my jacket and picked up my folder. One more thing, I said at the door. The proposal Hugh presented in Muskoka, Nora's inheritance as collateral. My lawyers transferred her inheritance this morning into a personal trust in her name alone. Alone, irrevocably, requiring her signature and a trustee independent of our family for any major transaction. The proposal is now a document about money that cannot be reached the way your father believed it could be reached. Tell your parents I appreciated the dinner. The lake view was exceptional. I walked out through the lobby and into the gray October morning and got into the F-150. The engine turned over. The heater ran warm. The crack in the windshield caught the flat morning light the way it always does, and I sat in the parking lot for a moment without moving. 33 years of being the man no one needed to look at twice, and knowing with complete certainty the entire time exactly who I was. I patted the dash once. Then I drove home to Alder Crescent. Nora arrived 40 minutes after I called her. I had tea already made, 2 cups on the old kitchen table that has been in that kitchen since 1994, next to the window that looks out at the maple tree. She sat down and looked at my face the way she has looked at my face since she was very small, reading it carefully, the way you read something you know is saying more than the words. I told her everything, from the beginning. The structure of Northmark, how I had built it and why I had kept it the way I had. The hallmark position, and what I had seen in Preston and what I had hoped for. The audit, the boardroom, the trust. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me?" It wasn't quite a question. I looked down at my cup. I looked out at the maple tree, the bare branches now, the structure of it clear in the November light. "Because I wanted you to build your own life," I said. "Not inherit my version of one. I didn't want you to look at me and see a portfolio. I wanted you to look at me and see your father. And when you brought someone home, I wanted to know that he chose you for who you are, not for what I had. That matters more to me than anything I ever built." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know, Dad. I've always known that about you," she cried, and I held her hand across the table and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. I thought about Hugh Holt up in Muskoka, waiting for news that was not going to arrive the way he expected. I thought about Carolyn, and her careful smile, and her comment about how fortunate Nora had been to find someone who could provide. I thought about Preston sitting in that boardroom, seeing himself clearly for perhaps the first time in a long while, and I hoped, genuinely, that he would do something useful with that. Then I let it go, because the only thing in the world that has ever mattered to me was sitting across this table, hands around a warm cup, looking at me with her mother's eyes and her 9-year-old certainty that she knew exactly who I was. She did know, she always had. Some people move quietly through the world and let it draw its conclusions. And when those conclusions are wrong, they do not correct them. They simply wait. The world always finds out eventually. It has never once failed to.